Well, welcome. I'm Doug Cogswell. I'm the President of Advisor Solutions, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar titled Attachment Stories, Use Cases of Creating and Using Attachment Scores in the Real World. This is a follow-up to a webinar we ran a couple months ago on attachment scores, creating them and how to use them. What's exciting here is we have a panel. We have 3 people from Dartmouth College joining us today, Mike Foote, Jean Romeo, and Claire Barden. We have Danilisa Radu, who is formerly Michigan State and University of Pennsylvania, and I would caveat probably one of the furthest along in the industry in actually putting sophisticated attachment scores together and using them. And then Sandy Yandel, who runs the annual fund at Northern Illinois University. So this is going to be, I think, a really rich experience. What I'm excited about is each of these schools are different places in the spectrum. So you're going to hear, one that's fairly far along, and a couple of others that are trying to figure out their way, and you'll hear where people actually are. So I'm going to just kick off here and do like a 5-minute review of last time's webinar, and we'll get right to the panel. So I'm going to cover what's an attachment score, how do you get one, and how do you use it. And this webinar is up on our www.advancementadvisor.com webinar page. It's pretty easy to find. We'll come back to this at the end. There'll also be a Q&A session at the end. So what's an attachment score? The idea here is to have a sort of a scientific way of measuring and using data to score people's affinity, attachment, or engagement with an institution and make it so it's not subjective, but it's reliable and consistent versus not reliable, and normalize this against the base. So what this means is we take data and we create scores that range from low to high. High would be there's a high degree of attachment. They've been to a lot of events. They've been engaged in committees. They come to everything. They love the place. On the left is none of that. They basically graduated and went away and have never done anything back again. And there's usually a profile. If you look at the number of prospects, there's a bell curve where there's a few at the very bottom, a few at the very top, and then a peak in the middle. And we generally like to range the scales from 0 to 0.3, and for weighting purposes, that makes sense. We also generally find these scores can be then grouped into segments. So maybe on the top right are the owners, the people who are most attached, most engaged, most aligned. The next group are the participants. They're heavily engaged, but they're not as strong as the owners. Then there's the interested players who have been engaged to a bit, could clearly be a lot more. And then on the left is the group that really aren't engaged. And the idea here is to move people from the left to the right. So what do you do with an attachment score? Well, in the last webinar, we talked about 4 different areas where they're very useful. And you'll hear bits and pieces of this today as we go through the panel. In annual giving, it really is helpful to identifying prospects who are most likely to respond to an appeal or an invite to an event. And it also helps you create different messages for differing segments. The owners are going to respond to different segments than the not engaged. The not engaged, you're going to have to really work around interest areas that attract their attention. Whereas the owners, they're loyal to the institution, so you can hit them with messages about traditions and themes and all the more normal stuff that gets messaged out. So it really does impact messaging. In major giving, we use it in prospect assignment, and also targeting activities for key prospects to increase attachment. So if you have a high-rated prospect who is non-engaged or just a participant, you want to focus activities and engagement development to move that person from the left to the right on that chart. In event attendance, the same thing. This helps you identify which prospects are most likely to respond to events and helps balance in getting the right message to the right people. It's also really helpful in solicitation levels. We did some work in the last webinar on how you can use this with capacity rating to create an expected value. So if somebody has a high capacity, but they're very low attachment, you wouldn't expect them to give very much. If they have a high capacity rating and a high engagement level, you'd expect them to give a lot more. And hence, somebody with a portfolio of high-rated prospects, it's hard to tell how much money you can actually expect to get out of that group until you attach this score along with it, which then helps give you this factored expected value approach. So there's a number of uses here. And I would also say that whenever we do modeling exercises, we find that this attachment or affinity really is pretty deterministic of who your larger donors are going to be. So it's useful in these 4 areas and really can have a big impact. Then we spend some time on how do you get one. There's a set of things that matter. Volunteer positions usually top it. Reunions attended, giving history, frequency and regularity, events attended, which ones, legacy admitted, denied, has an impact, positive on one, negative on the other. Newsletter click-throughs are indications of interest and also an area of interest by what they're actually clicking through on. We talked about student sports, student activities, and whether you have the email on file means has there been recent dialogue. But generally these will give somebody a higher score versus these. How many is enough or how much is enough? It depends. Some of our clients use 5, and we talked about, our view is it's better to get something going now with the data you have. Nobody has perfect data. I think Dana Lisa can talk a bit about, a very sophisticated score with 190 factors. And in the last webinar, we sort of went through what's the difference between 5 and 190. Well, the difference is, here you might look at numbers of events attended in the last 5 years. Here you might break it down into numbers of presidents' dinners attended in the last 5 years, numbers of presidents' dinners attended 5 to 10 years back, numbers of science symposiums attended. So you could break it into all these sub-pieces, which gives you much richer scoring, but you can get 70, 75% of the way with the 5 factors and then make it better over time. We urge to use what you have. Almost all of you have enough data to get started. Something's better than nothing, and start simple and refine over time were sort of the golden rules. So that's sort of the quick summary of last time. I would encourage you to do watch the webinar because it goes into quite a bit more detail and actually has some of the scoring algorithms and runs through some of the modeling we did behind the scenes to create weighted factors and so forth. So let's shift. The panel is going to talk about kind of what they've done, what's being contemplated, how it was done, how the scores are being used, lessons learned. And do remember that we're going to get a variety of experiences here from just getting started, thinking about it, to pretty far along. So Mike, let me point the mic to you and ask you kind of what's Dartmouth doing with attachment scores and what are you thinking about these days there?
You bet. Thanks, Doug. So the whole concept of engagement scoring is something we've been bouncing around and thinking about and playing around with for probably a couple of years now. As most folks know, we've been using predictive modeling and Advisor quite a bit already. We're looking for the concept of an engagement score to give us a more consistent measure that, in other words, would transcend any one moment in time to measure how connected an individual prospect might be. So right now we're looking for the engagement index to help us enhance how we're identifying prospects and to enhance our data mining processes in place right in research. We're also thinking about how we can use engagement index to set and assist field officers in the priority setting of their portfolios. So who are the best prospects that lie in their portfolio? How can we use the engagement index to help set agendas for prospect strategy meetings, to start thinking about and talking about those folks that are just not quite moving along at the pace that perhaps we think they should be. And then on the horizon is the idea of expanding how we're tracking field officer activity. And this is really where I think it has the most value and the most potential to have an impact. So the idea right now, most field officers here are measured on really, when you break it down, 2 main metric points, and that is the number of visits that they've had in a particular month or year, as well as the size of the gifts that are coming in from the prospects they're assigned to. And the problem there is many field officers, not only here but everywhere for the most part, they will often say, I'm doing all of the right things, but whether or not somebody makes a gift is really out of my control. I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, but the gift is not coming in. And this would provide a manager of field officers an opportunity to have a discussion to say, hey, based on this engagement index, it looks like you're doing all the right things. Keep going. The gift will come in time. And that will prove to be quite valuable to each of those officers as well as to their manager. So that's a little bit of where we've been, some of our thinking around it. I'm going to throw it over to Gene Romeo it's really, since her recent arrival and given her unique title and position here in development and in advancement overall, is really allowing us to kickstart this project here at Dartmouth. So I'll kick it right over to Jean.
Thanks, Mike. I arrived at Dartmouth just this past summer, and as Mike said, in a new position here that bridges both development and alumni relations. So while I have a lot of focus on primary research projects, one of my charges was to develop metrics to help us evaluate and improve the effectiveness of our program, especially across alumni relations. So that's how I got involved in working on an engagement index. So while Mike is really using the index to quantify engagement on an individual level, like he spoke about for ask amounts, for identifying donors we should staff, etc., I have a little bit of a different perspective, but in using the same measure, I'm really interested in understanding alumni engagement for our alumni population as a whole. And looking at engagement across, once we develop this metric, we want to look at engagement across segments of our population. So just like we track the percentage of our alumni that donate to the annual fund, we want to track the percentage of our alumni who are engaged and what levels of engagement they're at. So our goal is to have an engagement metric in our dashboard in Advisor, so we can go in and see this metric across segments and monitor how it's changing across time across all alumni. So that's just a little bit of background of how kind of Mike and I got together, why we were interested in the engagement metric. And I'm going to turn it over to Claire now, who's going to really talk about how did we pull together this need for alumni relations and development, and how did we start in identifying the variables?
Sure. Thanks, Jean. Because our end goal is this engagement index that captures development and giving data, but also alumni relations data, we found ourselves faced with huge amounts of data right up front. And in our end goal, we imagine this model to be highly sophisticated, very dynamic, very fluid. It can be utilized by different departments within the advancement umbrella. It could output information relevant to field officers on an individual level, on a portfolio level, on a departmental level, but also for alumni relations professionals as well, to think about how are their alumni engaging with the college in ways that may not be tied to dollars. So you can quickly imagine we were paralyzed by having so much information and trying to build a perfect model that would do everything we wanted it to do right up front. And following Doug's advice, which he reviewed in the beginning of this webinar today, we found it most manageable to simplify to very, very broad buckets, thinking about broad dimensions that we wanted to build into this model. Those broad dimensions, we've called them give, go, do, and did. The give bucket would capture donation information, which exists in a variety of variables. Go captures event participation information. Do captures volunteer activities. And did captures activities that many in our database participated in when they were students, if they're alumni of the college. So from these four very broad, again, very simple 50,000-foot view dimensions, we could then get going defining those variables and gaining some traction in actually building this model. I know, Doug, one of your questions was lessons learned, so I wanted to just cover a few of those so far. Again, we're at sort of beginning stages here, but we do have many lessons learned. But two of those larger lessons, one is to evaluate your own data and understand, are you capturing the data that you need? And if so, are you capturing it in a way that's usable? An example from our experience, we found that our event information captured the venue, both by region and whether it was a physical or a virtual event, like a webinar. That information was only captured in the event title in our database, which isn't usable in this model, or to cut data by whether an individual participates only in virtual events but never in physical events, for example. So we don't have that data right now, but we can still move forward without it, and it can be an enhancement that we add into the model later. And now we're aware of that, so we can go back and correct our data as it's captured. And the second lesson is self-evident, but we found really starting simple is the key to getting started. Like Doug says, anything is better than nothing, and we can add these refinements and these enhancements later, but having something allows us to move forward.
That's a great quick run-through on what's been a lot of work. Has there been any organizational resistance to what you're doing, or once you get these scores, people understand them? And well, obviously you've got, especially on the major giving side, we're using them with portfolio assignments. I could picture some pushback that these aren't right or there's issues with them. How has that been handled?
I would say yes. There has been some pushback early on as folks have become more comfortable with understanding how they're being used and that they're not being utilized in any sort of punitive looking view. They're more there to provide dialogue between a manager and a field officer, for instance, around where a particular prospect is not moving along, and to flag them, flag that prospect as an opportunity to have some discussion on what can or cannot be done, what's working, where we've had similar situations, and where we might be able to borrow from those situations to help move a particular prospect along. Overall, I think it's just like any new concept. Until we have some proof of success, and we're finding those a little bit along the way, until we have those successes on a broader scale, it's going to continue to be tough to get overall buy-in.
I'd say, Mike, your point about, and we see this in a lot of our work with performance-based metrics, is the fact that they're positioned so that they're coaching tips or they help drive discussion. That goes a lot further than if they come across as metrics, which can in fact be punitive. If you've just, same concept, but you flip the tone of it and engage around them, it usually the uptake and the endorsement's a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
There's by the way, those of you listening, if you've got questions for the Dartmouth group, just you can type them in on the right panel. There's a question panel. We're going to pick up those questions and ask them to the whole group at the end. So just be aware there will be an open question period at the end. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask, is there anything else that, before we move to Dana, Lisa, that you guys want to add that we didn't just cover, and remembering there is a question period coming? Sounds like we're good.
I think Dana, Lisa, I want to afford her time as well, but I think that she'll be able to talk about a later stage within this attachment score process that will be helpful for listeners as well.
Yeah. So let's, Dana, Lisa, you're on. I know that you've done this for a while, and we've done a lot of work in this area, and you have some of the more robust attachment scores that we've seen. And if you could just take us through kind of your experience in calculating them and getting them into use, would be great.
Sure. Most recently at MSU, our team was tasked with developing and assigning an affinity score, and the original goal was to help evaluate constituents in the gift officer portfolios. So this was actually going to be one part in a three-tiered approach. So the teams were looking at incorporating stage continuum, capacity, and this new affinity score to realign the portfolio's best fit with the constituents as well as the gift officers. And what we found over time, and after this was developed, it's basically being used across multiple business platforms and functions. So it's now become a tool in strategic planning and day-to-day ops. And the one thing, I don't know if we'll talk about it later, or it's a good time to bring this up, it was structured in a bucketed approach. So, and Dartmouth talked about this as well. So we did the same thing. We grouped our 190 factors into 6 categories. So the larger categories would be giving, for example, or biographical information, then the categories within those buckets. But the important benefit of that approach is when you're tracking deltas over time, it allows you to see any gaps in not only the prospect management approach of, where are people lagging per se, or what's working, and then where are the gaps to help them along the engagement continuum. So I think that's the highest level overview I can give for the MSU model we just developed. So Doug, I don't know if we're saving the details for later, or you'd like me to go into further detail.
Well, I was going to ask, because with what you did, I mean, with the larger number of factors, it requires obviously pretty fine-grained data. I mean, obviously with 5 factors, you can have thinner data with 190 or whatever you were working with. You need a lot richer data. How did you deal with that? I mean, was the data there? Did it require a front-end effort to collect and store better data? Talk about that for a minute.
MSU Advancement is making a lot of effort in data integrity in their new records team and whatnot, but that problem is universal, what I've seen, across institutions. So data was missing, it was incomplete, and again, this is everywhere. When we began, we looked at over 500 factors, so this is actually what was whittled down to. We absolutely removed anything that was not good as far as, across the data set, so we thought we can always add it in later, like you said, when it's trustworthy and robust. And we actually looked at 3 factors. When we evaluated each data point, we had 3 considerations for every factor, and this is how the 190 passed muster, but we looked at data robustness, so basically how much was populated across the constituent base, and if it was not robust enough or broad enough, we removed it. We also looked at the integrity and validity of the data, so from an accuracy point of view, if the data was accurate and we trusted it, we brought it into the model. And the third consideration was the pertinence from a business rule standpoint. So basically, does the data we're looking at to include represent and align with how we do business? So for example, you might have great data from 15 years ago, but if it's not relevant or pertinent to business as it's conducted today in the institution, it may not be relevant. And if it is relevant from a historical point of view, maybe you want to include it, but with a smaller point scale to represent it, but where it won't skew the model. So we looked at those 3 considerations for every data point, and having done that, we landed on the 190.
Do you have, so one of the issues I know that the way you get the larger factors, if you take something like, reunion committee participation, say that's a event type or something, and you could have done that in one of the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years back, 10 to 20 years back. There's different time periods. Obviously, it has a lot more weight if it happens recently than further ago. And at some point, you can just grab the last 5 years, the last 10 years. How did you? Because I know this is relevant to everybody. Think about time on these kinds of events and participations. How far back did you go? How did you figure out the weighting between the first 5 years, the next 5 years, the period after that?
Okay, so that's a bunch of questions. Let me start with it.
Yep.
So when we built this, we wanted to make this statistical. So we wanted to put some math and measurement behind anecdotal data, which everyone wants to do. So to keep that statistical, we actually used RFE analysis. So we infused 3 levels of breakdown for each factor, so recency, frequency, and value for everything. And that's what made it time-consuming. So to your point, for example, if we looked at engagement or volunteers, we in some cases had to hard code, but we looked at what our codes were and what they represented, and then we would bucket that by a grade or a scale. So are you a volunteer? Are you a board member? Did you have another role, maybe not as heavy duty 5 years ago? So we looked at that, and depending on what the factors were, we tiered them out as well. So for example, if there was engagement, and again, this changed across factors because it depends on the business, but it could be if you were engaged in the last 1 to 3 years, that was a particular score. If it was 4 to 5 years, if it was 6 to 10, if it was 11 plus. So we did layer our factors with RFE. And the way we also determined, I think with any model scoring predictive, the time you put in is upfront. So when we were building this statistically, we looked at measures of central tendency for each factor. So that's how we normalized against the base. We looked at central tendency for each of these factors across all the constituents, and we looked at dispersion of each value so we could determine our spread and then the corresponding weights. We also, for not so much anomalies, but for outliers, we used a mathematical formula to determine that so nothing would skew the weight assignment. So we did this for each of the factors, and again, that's what takes the team and the time to put this together the right way.
If you were giving advice, like suppose you just wanted to get, the 5 or the 10 factor version of this going, the period over which you look at these things, did you create some rules like if it's more than 10 years back, it's pretty much not relevant, or was it 15 or 5 years?
Not necessarily across the board. It depended. So for giving, for example, I don't believe there was a cutoff in time. We would make something. We would define it by 20 years ago plus, or if they gave consecutive years, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, eventually 20 plus. So we wanted to represent time, but not have it punitive if someone didn't necessarily reach that point. So we did that. But as far as how someone can do this, it doesn't have to be this intense. You know, to your point, you could start with 5 or 10 factors, and the scoring doesn't have to necessarily be this advanced. You could basically do a counter. So if someone is a donor, they get a 1. If someone's attended an event, they get a 1. And you can just accumulate the points and sum it up. You could also do what you said when you referenced earlier in the slide, a hierarchy. So perhaps a donor to one institution is more important than a volunteer, so it's a multiplier of 3, then a multiplier of 2. So there are different ways to approach this simplistically, but it's still infusing knowledge that someone can leverage when they're making their decisions.
Yeah, and in the webinar from January, we did some of that. We kind of, if you have like 5 or 10 things, you know, how can you start thinking about assigning weights to them? And there's some standard relationships that, you know, they could be tweaked, but some of the things do count more than others. So what Dana Lisa was just saying, you can attach a higher score weight to, you know, recent committee participation than, you know, student played a sport, you know, 30 years ago kind of a thing, and then you pretty much get something working pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dana Lisa, what are there things that didn't work well or lessons you'd like to communicate to the group here?
What we learned prior to this model, so thankfully we were in a position to have benefit, but what we learned was you want to keep things out of the model that won't dilute it. So, for example, this is a common event attendance. It seems everyone has it, but it's not across the board and it's not consistent. So we want to minimize anything that could skew the model. If some alumni group has the data included and other pockets may not. So that's what we learned over time, so we knew going into this model not to do it. And with all the efforts of data integrity and data acquisition, you know, all the models can be enhanced going forward because no model should ever be done. You always want to do the post-implementation review, and at that point add more data. So we learned basically just use good data. I would rather have a sound model that's simplistic than a more complicated model that's uncertain.
Well, you made a good point. The data that can be bad is there's some systematic skew in it. So, like, yeah, if it's some alumni groups are putting the data in and others aren't, you're then going to penalize the alums who were in the groups that just didn't put the data in the system because they're going to come up with a no score and the others will. That's where it starts. If there's like a systematic error like that, you got to watch it.
Exactly, and that's where institutional knowledge is so important because it should be a team effort. For example, if you're including responses to solicitations or events or whatnot, any kind of response or a survey response, what I learned back at UPenn was actually this was where you really have to connect with your colleagues at work is because they might have sent a survey out and, you know, someone coming in looking at a model say, okay, there's a survey response, but without the institutional knowledge, maybe you didn't realize that the survey was sent to only your $1 million donors. So again, it's not just the data in the system, it's the history behind it. Just understanding that before you pull it into the model.
Right. Well, thanks. And you'll be wrapped back in a few minutes when we get to the Q&A. I'm going to shift to Northern Illinois and Sandy Yandel, and just caveat that Sandy's bravely back in the office recovering from some speaking and coughing challenges. So welcome, Sandy, and thanks for joining us. What's up at NIU?
All right, thank you. Again, I apologize if you can't hear me. I'm going to try really hard. At NIU, I first started in prospect research, and that's when Doug first approached us about Advisor. And we actually started with some predictive models with major donors and like the middle of the pyramid donors. But where I've been focusing my attention the last about year is the annual fund. And kind of like Doug said at the beginning, with the annual fund, our focus is on identifying potential new donors. So we have a pretty large alumni base, and it is physically impossible for us to solicit everyone in a fiscal year. And so we want to not only narrow our focus so that we can solicit as many people as possible, but also not everyone wants to give. Not everyone is connected to the university. And so much like in major giving, you want to give the gift officers, the people with the most affinity for the school and the likelihood to give and the capacity, we want to do the same in the annual fund, just on a different scale. And so we use attachment scores, particularly right now for our telefund, for our non-donors because that pool is so big. And we use a lot of the same predictive fields as the major gifts, but in different ways, and not all of the same things are predictive. One interesting thing that we found when we created our scores was that back several years ago we had done data mining with an outside vendor, and the score that was supposed to indicate whether or not someone would be a good excuse me, major gift donor actually was even more predictive for someone to be an annual fund donor who had never given before. And so by using these scores, not only including whether or not they participated in student activities or alumni activities, but all these other different factors, we built a pretty strong model. We have about 15 factors in our annual giving model, so we're still at the beginning stage. We're not nearly as far as down, Lisa, but we're finding that the attachment scores are actually working very well, and so we're pleased with what we have so far.
Hey, Sandy, how did you get the weighting for the factors? Did you use predictive modeling, or did you some other mathematical form, or sort of best judgment? Or I know there's a variety of different approaches you use to get the weighting factors.
We use the predictive analytics tool in Advisor. We had tried to do some of our own weighting and things in the past, and like I said, going with outside vendors, but several years ago when we tried to use an outside vendor to come up with the weighting system, we found that our data was pretty terrible, and so it was not very predictive. And then we tried to do it ourselves while we were building up the quality of our data, but still it just wasn't nearly as good as we found with the predictive model and being able to include things that are kind of hard to weight in themselves and against other things. So we use predictive analytics, the predictive model.
And once you've got the weightings and the scores, how often are they in the system, so they're updating every day, or how often do they get updated?
Well, right now we wanted to give it some time to test how well this initial model did. We started it at the end of January, so it's been just about 2 months since the scores have been started to be used in the telefund. We'll probably give it another month, and then we'll see how they compare to last year's non-donor pools, because we've been looking at them on a surface value, but I want to actually kind of do some analytics on it, and we want to update the model to include new data that we get into the system and such, but we have not updated it yet. But we've also just kind of started, so we want to give it a little chance to work.
Are you at the point where you can start talking about return on investment or benefits of this financially?
Of the scores?
Yeah, of using scores like this.
I don't know that we have we haven't done any analysis on it yet, because like I said, we just have put them into the telefund and put them to use. But for me, looking over the entire program, being able to see results is worth it for us, because we have such a large non-donor pool. And before this year, we really were using next to nothing to segment that non-donor pool, and so our acquisition rates were just terrible. And we have a couple 100,000 people to work with, and so it shouldn't be that terrible. We should be able to narrow it down. And so we're hoping that not only are we acquiring donors this year, but this model will help us acquire donors that will be retained for years to come. So I guess for me, the big test will come, are we going to retain them next year? So that's kind of where my focus is.
You just made, I think, a great point. I mean, we've seen this on the annual fund a number of times, and it is a key metric for non-donors that can target with messaging, and different levels of expected return are obviously going to come from the higher scores. And I know many schools have very limited information on that non-donor pool, and this is a huge potential asset there.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess one of our challenges was trying to make sure that the data wasn't skewed, kind of going back to what Danelisa was saying about what matters, how far back does it go. And we have a lot of information on our major gift donors, and so we kind of had to remove them from the equation so that it wasn't skewed towards them, because we do solicit our major gift donors as well. But we wanted to make sure that the model was measuring a level playing field.
Yeah, if you go back to that chart I showed at the beginning about the owners, the participants, and on the left the non-engaged and so forth. Yeah, if on the right tend to be the major giving prospects who have been courted more and are more engaged, and if you put them in with a bunch of non-donors, you're going to get a tight narrowing of that band on the non-donors, where if you take them out and the non-donors are more of a consistent pool, your point is well taken. You're going to spread them across better and get more differentiation.
Mm-hmm. Well, even the major gift, the prospects that we haven't engaged yet but just have been identified, they're often have undergone research, and more data than a typical constituent database has been entered, and so we just wanted to make sure that that also wasn't skewing it as well.
Yeah. Any surprises as you went through this, negatives that you didn't expect? Talk a bit about that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, and any surprises, unexpected consequences, negatives come out?
Nothing negative that I've seen yet. Like I said, the biggest surprise for me was seeing that the affinity score for major gift donors was even more predictive than what was designed as an acquisition score. So we've been using that more heavily than the acquisition score that was run. So that was a big surprise. Most other things that were there in the model to create our attachment score are pretty standard. We found that some of our colleges are more predictive than others, which makes sense. Someone who's graduated from the College of Business is probably more likely to be a donor than a general person from our art school. But within each of those schools, we can identify who is most likely to be a donor. So, and we found that having graduated both spouses from the university is pretty heavily weighted, which again makes sense. We also found that we did a wealth screening that we included as one of our, like the bins were included in the score, and it was nice to see that they actually were fairly predictive in our major gift and like leadership giving model. So it also was a way to see how well our other scoring systems did. But the nice thing about using the predictive model to create the scores is we could include things like that as well.
Mm-hmm. Good. Anything else you'd like to add? We're about to move to the Q&A session.
I don't think so. I would just, like everyone else, advocate for the best data that you can possibly have to create a score so it's actually meaningful, because it's useful to us now because our data has meaning and the scores, like all the different parts of the attachment score have meaning. So.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm going to open it up to the whole panel now. We have quite a number of questions that have come in. We'll get through as many as we can in the remaining time, and we'll answer the rest of them by email or follow up after the webinar. There's a set of them around the advantages as the three of you, the five of you and the three institutions here have mostly done this in-house. What's the advantage of doing this in-house versus farming it out to outside consultants? So feel free to jump in on that one.
Can I take that one, Doug?
Go ahead.
All right, it's Danelisa. I think the advantage of doing this in-house is those are the folks who have the knowledge of the institution. So the history that's important. I think if this is properly farmed out, those folks would be doing so much prep work, you might as well just close the loop. I'm a fan of, if you have that knowledge and that skill set, it's better to develop something in-house that you can manage and own over time, but that's just my opinion.
I'll follow that up with, I completely agree. being able to, even though Advisor helped us build our predictive model, we sat there and we were an active part of the process. And so if something came up, we could be like, oh, well, we only have that because such and such a person physically entered it. We don't have that in all of our data. And we could like look at something and immediately know if it was skewed in some way. Plus, now we can update it. It's not static. We don't have to farm it out in a year or two and go through the same process again. I mean, now we can adjust it as necessary and build on it for the future.
Yeah, Mike, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, we would mirror both of those opinions. It's definitely just easier and quicker to do it in-house. We know the data best. We know all the different scenarios. And keeping it in-house allows us to just be more nimble in changing it and tweaking it, sometimes on the fly.
Yeah, and it's sort of a related question here is how often do the scores get updated? Sandy talked a bit about that. How about you, Mike and Dana Lisa? What's your current experience or plans with that?
I can kick it off. We've started thinking about that. Once we get the attachment scores created, we'll get them captured somewhere, and then, we were thinking monthly or quarterly to start. It would be great if we got to a point where they were in real time, and we were able to capture the historical perspective. That would be the ultimate. But I think monthly or quarterly is probably enough for the type of work that we're doing.
Yeah, because you don't want, on the one hand, people bouncing around between the segments all the time. Yet, on the other hand, if you're soliciting someone and last weekend they accepted a position as a reunion chair and went to some major event, they should bump up and score, and you'd like to see that. So there is clearly a frequency issue. Dana, Lisa, what do you think about that?
When I left MSU, and if I'm not sure what they're doing now, so if anyone has a question, they should definitely feel free to contact the MSU analytics team. But what we did was we had the SQL in Advisor, and we had that connected to the warehouse table, so we could generate the score daily. The ultimate goal, we got it in our advanced database, the system for everyone to see and report out on. As far as how often, we ran them actually, I think we did it weekly just for our information purposes, so we could start tracking deltas, and in preparation for reporting out, develop some reports of what's most meaningful. So I think the ultimate goal was to go to a monthly update in the system, so not just on the back end refresh the data, which we kept the archives. It's just a matter of running it monthly and getting that monthly updated number and score in the front-end database. So again, I'm not sure where it stands now, but that was our goal.
Yeah, Sandy, any more you'd like to add to that?
Doug, this is Mike, and I think just jumping off of Dan and Lisa's point, the frequency of how often you update them might very well be a function of how nimble the organization is to take any action on significant changes in an attachment score. So, we have our portfolios. There's a lot of work being generated with current prospects and so on. If suddenly somebody jumps out, and if we're updating them on a daily basis, and every day we're seeing folks jump out, and we're not nimble enough right now to immediately contact or begin engagement, daily would not probably work for us. So it's likely we'll start on that quarterly basis, and then it'll be nice over time to shoot towards a daily update.
So there's a number of questions here about what systems are you using to capture the data, what software do you use to enter the events data, opening rate of newsletters, etc. Is this manually done? How do you get this so it's easy? I know everybody's had challenges with this, so you guys could talk through what you do to get, it sounds like specifically the different ones that are coming up are events, attendance captured, anything you might be doing with newsletters, which has generally been a challenge because the hosters don't make it easy to get the sends, committee participation, those kinds of things. Who wants to start?
So, Doug, this is Mike at Dartmouth again. I can just weigh in on event information. We're currently using the event module within Advanced to capture invitation lists and who's attending or not.
I know one of the challenges, though, is somebody at the event actually has to, and I know one of the tricks is you have ID badges for everybody who comes, has to collect them and then subtract the ones that are left over from the ones who signed up. So there actually has to be some kind of a process where it never actually gets in the system.
Right. It's interesting, and I think we might have touched on this before, in being careful and having that institutional knowledge of what data you're going to include in the model or not. One of the sort of data surprises we had just recently is the fact that our business school, which hosts a whole number of events, was not getting those captured in our database of records. So any model we created on the folks that are professional school grads, we had to make sure we were not including event data in that particular model. At the same time, after discovering that, we went back and we're now getting that event information into the system. The one nuance is that we're capturing everyone that came to the event. What we don't have are the original invite lists. So we have to, again, have that institutional knowledge that when we run the model and we look at who attended events, that as opposed to the undergrad side where we have the invite list and then the second data element of who attended, we can create a ratio of how many times was an individual invited before they attended an event. We won't have that on the professional school side. So we have to be careful and again, have that institutional knowledge that we fully understand what we're looking at.
I'm going to ask you another question, Mike, and come back to Dana-Lisa and Sandy about the same question. Attachment data could come from several schools, entities, departments. How did you get everyone on the same page? So you mentioned Tuck versus the college. Obviously, they've got they've got an advancement group over there. How do you get them all thinking this is important? We need to all get into the system.
It's just we had some proof of concept on the undergraduate side, some success stories, showing them what we're able to do now from both the modeling and what we're hoping to do from this standpoint with engagement/attachment scores. And they got it. They got it pretty quickly, but it's just constantly being over there and hitting them from different angles, not only myself but other colleagues here at the college, consistently meeting with them and speaking about it and demonstrating how this might have a very positive impact on the work that they're doing over there.
So Sandy, Dana-Lisa, do you want to add to this? The two questions are, how do you get the event type of information in the system, and then what do you do when you've got multiple schools which you need to get multiple groups on board to do this?
This is Dana-Lisa, I can't add much to what Mike said because I agree with those event issues and concerns and the approach. I would be happy to speak to the multiple schools. We had so much at MSU, so much support from leadership and understanding. So it wasn't, this is a lot of the data science is a PR effort too on our part as data scientists and analysts. But we had so much support from above, it was easier to help us pave the way. And when teams are in place and you partner with these different colleges, it does evolve over time with that understanding of what these models can do and these analytic reports can do. So that was working in our favor when we built this model. But the one thing that was almost a cyclical issue was when we rolled out the scores, and we encountered those questions of, someone thought this particular person or donor alumni would be in the top tier, and we explained, okay, because we were accountable to the score, so we had to explain and verify why that final score is what it is. What it also did was it made staff accountable to the data. So and what we found out in several conversations were people knew of things, but it wasn't entered in the database, or it was in an Excel spreadsheet or a shadow database. So it promotes accountability in both directions, us to the score and then end users also to the data. But as Mike said as well, it comes with partnering and showing the benefits of these projects over time, so the buy-in is there.
Sandy, anything you'd like to add to this thread?
Yeah, we keep track of all of that event data in Millennium, which is our database. We're lucky that we from start to finish, at some point in the past, somebody decided that we should actually keep all of that data from the invitation to who comes. Someone actually sits with a computer at the check-in for the events that both the Alumni Association and the Foundation put on, and keep track of that data. So the smaller colleges events, it's really whatever they give us. We've been working very hard over the last couple of fiscal years to get all the information they can give us, and the gift officers have been an advocate for those things because they know that the more data that we have, not only will it help like these attachment scores and predictive modeling, but it will help the research that we do and how we make connections to different prospects and different potential donors. We just have ingrained in as many people as possible that the more data we get in the database, the more we can manipulate it. And so it really, for us, has been bringing everyone on board and getting it all in the central database from start to finish.
Yeah, I think as we look at across our client base, the points here are key, and it's this idea of either somebody from the top has to endorse this as a direction and a strategy, or, as I think Mike said, there need to be some success stories that get people excited about, we need to spend the effort to get this data in the system because it's going to help us do a better job, be more efficient, raise more money, or whatever the benefits are. And then there's an upswing. By itself, an attachment score is an attachment score, but if people can see how it can help them raise more money, be better targeted, it's a really good thing, which actually leads to our next question. There's a series of them about, what is sort of the essence of these things. And this one, I think, captures it. Are the attachment scores that are built predictive of giving? Sounds like institutions use the scores differently, but that seems to be the key. And I'll start by saying, Advisor does a lot of different modeling exercises with clients. And, there's another question about target and base population. Whenever we take a target population of larger donors and we compare it to the rest of the population, there's usually a bunch of factors. There's all the biographic factors, there's the degrees factors, there's the ratings, and there's their giving history, and then there's all these attachment pieces. The attachment pieces come up really high. So the attachment, it's a measure of opt-in engagement, and it's an interest level, and it is predictive of giving, and it's predictive, so it doesn't mean somebody with a high attachment score and a high capacity is going to make a large gift, but it shows they're a lot more likely to than people who don't have those scores, and it's a way of grouping them and then being more efficient and effective is what we see. But let's go back. That was my answer. Let's go back to the rest of the panel. Just jump in and saying at the high level, what do you guys see as the major benefit of these things, and are they predictive of giving?
I think this could springboard into predictive modeling, although scoring models, these are not predictive models per se, but they are indicative of engagement and giving because that's self-built into the model. The model represents what's going on historically and currently. So you can absolutely use this by looking at the score distribution, whether by tier or bucket. Folks from, let's say, the average score up tend to be your engaged folks and your donors and whatnot. And the other interesting thing is, folks who are lower on this ladder, lower on the scale, it's predictive of, it's not even predictive, it's reflecting that they're not engaged and they're not giving. So it's so great because it's a strategic approach to anything from mailing to the right people and not wasting or not allocating those funds or resources for people who are showing you they're not engaging in giving. You can also use it for perhaps purging old records in your database. Look at the zeros. So there's so much to it, and it's not a predictive model, but it absolutely shows, it would help you predict how people are going to act because this is how they've been acting.
Yeah, it's one element of a predictive model, but
right.
a key one.
And I would, just going back to what Dana Lisa said about the behavior and putting your resources where your constituents are showing you that they should be used. If someone doesn't respond to anything and hasn't responded to anything, then why would you continue to spend the money to send them things or call them or invite them to events when someone else who you may not have been inviting to the events is showing you, based on their past behavior, that they want to be invited and have the potential to give in the future? Then why wouldn't you focus on those particular people, especially now, like with budget cuts and having these ever-growing pools and even more graduates or people investing in institutions? I mean, you want to put your money and your effort into the people that want to be solicited, who want to be invited, who want to be engaged.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I mean, the end goal obviously is to raise more money. I mean, we wouldn't be doing this if we weren't trying to raise money. So we hope that at the end of the day that they're in some way predictive of giving. That's kind of the end result.
And actually, is another question that this sort of answers right here. Is a model can show that someone is ideal annual fund donor if they've been asked every year and haven't given. So what is the upshot of these scores? I think you kind of said it. These are indicators that someone's more likely to give, but doesn't necessarily mean they will give. That's based on how they're asked, what message they get, how they feel at the time they're asked, what their current liquidity is, a whole bunch of other factors that determine whether they will then in fact give. But at least this is an indication they're more likely to give than somebody else in the same position.
And one thing to add is maybe you're asking them the wrong way. I mean, if you look back and you say that you've only ever called them, you've never sent them anything, maybe even if your policy is not to mail a non-donor, maybe those few people that are supposed to be good annual fund donors but have not given yet, maybe it's worth a test to those people, and it's just the way you're asking. But it also is entirely possible that it is just a score, and it's supposed to be like a starting point. So it's.
Yeah, we've also found that the messaging matters too, and there's, some people respond well to the tradition. It's time to rally and give to the institution. Others rally more around specific purposes, a neuroscience center or some message about sports. Some people don't like sports; they would not respond to that message. But you can figure those things out from something that's been hard to collect, but I urge everybody to go to your hoster and get it. It's the email click-throughs, because that's current. The click-throughs are the things that the people are interested in reading about your institution. And the other one is the events they attend. You can, by the event type, you can start figuring out where their interest areas are. And then if you get that, tailoring the messages is going to create a more likely connection. Mike, you've been quiet for a while. Anything you'd like to add to this?
No, I think you just hit on something of interest. In part of our process of thinking about what we want to include in our scores, there's a whole segment of data that historically we haven't been capturing. And I'm thinking of the new pieces of data, like who's following the Dartmouth feed on Twitter? Do we have a list of those individuals? Who has liked us on Facebook? All those social networking avenues, and certainly that touches on click-throughs of newsletters and so on, but those are interesting, relatively new data pieces that would be wonderful if we could get our heads around and start incorporating into these types of models, because I think that's certainly for the younger generation where we don't have the historical giving information and the depth of event attendance and so on. These other avenues, I think, will continue to prove to be much more important by class year decade or by decade.
Yeah, good point. Where I know we're running to the end here, I'm going to ask one more question, and some concluding comments. This is from a two-year college. Would it be helpful to collect data on those students involved in organizations, honor societies? So as alumni, we can solicit them. So larger question is, what do you do with student information and all of this, and how important is that?
Can I address that one, Doug?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, I think it's important. If you don't have it, that's fine. If you have it, leverage it, because what we found predictively with correlation is students who are engaged tend to become your alumni who are engaged. So it's important if you have it. And then what you might want to think about doing with student data is what we've done in the past is, again, bucket that. So maybe you want to separate an athletic component versus fraternity or sorority component or a student leadership component. So however granular your data is, see how best you can leverage it.
Yeah, great point. And we've seen schools where the data has not been put in the system or not transferred from the student side to the advancement side. And in some cases, they've had students mine through yearbooks and just basically, it's not the most exciting job, but take the data in the yearbooks and code it into the system because that's a pretty good capturing of the student body's activities for each year.
Right, and academic. Oh, sorry, Doug.
Go ahead.
I was going to say academic data as well. If you know your students are majors in whatever coursework, and then tie that to those appeals. So obviously, typically, if you have an alumni from the business school, but it's interesting to note over time how their giving and their actions correlate or do not correlate to their undergraduate academic data. Because if you were ever to infuse some kind of math in these models with something I would call a passion indicator, maybe you want to track over time or analyze, are they giving to something, were they a scholarship recipient? Are they giving to scholarship endeavors? So there's a way you can actually leverage all this data. I think we're all limited by our just time and creativity.
So there are more questions. We will be following up with them after the webinar. We're a couple minutes into overtime here already. I'd like to thank Mike, Jean, Claire, Dana, Lisa, and Sandy for joining us. And just if you guys have any last comments you'd like to make, we've got kind of a minute or two here where we can make them. So open mic for a minute here.
I would just like to encourage people to try and to see what they can put together, because you can always modify and improve over time. But I think getting a quick win and starting is a very important step, and I would encourage people not to be fearful not to do this.
And I would say there's so much great data out there, and making it meaningful for your institution or your university is just one great step that you can take to narrowing down who you should be talking to, who you should be inviting. And you can use these attachment scores in so many ways, and Doug kind of previewed a lot of them, and you can really make it work for you. And so you shouldn't be afraid to kind of dive in head first, because there's a lot of different factors, but it's really worth it in the end.
Mike, anything you and your team would like to add?
We absolutely mirror both of those points. You just get started and then navigate through that process, and you'll find some early successes, I'm sure, and you'll make adjustments along the way. But and you'll find advocates for what you're trying to do right there in your institution, and just get started. It's easier than it might seem from afar.
Great. Well, I would like to thank the 5 of you for joining us. Appreciate the time. We will be answering the additional questions, and this has been recorded and will be posted within a week or so up on our advancementadvisor.com webinar, and the prequel to this is also up there, and you can find it on our webinar page, which is on one of the panels across the top. So again, thanks for the time today. Appreciate it, and have a great rest of the afternoon. Take care.
Hey, Doug, you still there?